everyone. Welcome to Unchained, your no-hype resource for all things crypto. I'm your host, Laura Shin. You may have heard, Unchained is doing a survey. We want to know, how do you think we can make the show better? How would you like to see Unchained expand? If you could just take a moment and go to surveymonkey.com/r/Unchained-survey-2019. That's surveymonkey.com/r/Unchained-survey-2019. Your answers will be a huge help to me and my team here at Unchained. Also, those who answer the survey can enter to win one of 5 free Casa Bitcoin Lightning nodes, plus a free year of Casa's Gold membership, including a multi-sig security app for iPhone and Android, a Trezor hardware wallet, a Casa Faraday bag, and 24/7 support. Those of you interested in learning more about Casa or about protecting your Bitcoin investment generally should check out my interview with CEO Jeremy Welch. Thank you to Casa for donating. Again, the URL is surveymonkey.com/r/Unchained-survey-2019. Go there now to give us your thoughts on the future direction of Unchained and enter the giveaway.
Kraken is the best exchange in the world for buying and selling digital assets. It has the tightest security, deep liquidity, and a great fee structure with no minimum or hidden fees. Whether you're looking for a simple fiat on-ramp or leveraged options trading, Kraken is the place for you. CipherTrace cutting-edge cryptocurrency intelligence powers anti-money laundering, blockchain analytics, and threat intel. Leading exchanges, virtual currency businesses, banks, and regulators themselves use CipherTrace to comply with regulation and to monitor compliance.
My guest today is Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation and a lecturer at Singularity University. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
In a short time, you and the Human Rights Foundation have become visible forces and advocates for Bitcoin and decentralized technologies. But before we get to your work in the blockchain space, let's start with some background. What does the Human Rights Foundation do?
The Human Rights Foundation promotes civil and political liberties like free speech, freedom of and from religion, freedom of assembly, the right to participate in your government, and we promote these rights and we protect these rights in what we call closed societies or authoritarian countries, countries that are ruled by some sort of repressive government, whether it's a dictatorship or a king or a tyrant or a military junta.
And something that surprised me when I was researching this was that it was just founded in 2005?
Incorporated in 2005, and we started operations in 2006, correct.
And what have been the biggest campaigns so far?
Well, in many ways, Thor Halvorsen, our founder, started the Human Rights Foundation as a reaction to what wasn't happening with regard to the world's worst human rights violations. So there were a lot of countries, and still are, unfortunately, ranging from North Korea to Eritrea to Uzbekistan, where they don't get a huge amount of media attention in certain aspects, and there's just not a lot of funding or support available to help people inside. And the Human Rights Foundation is in many ways kind of like acting as a voice for the voiceless and as a support network for people who live under these extremely repressive environments. And it's a lot more people than you might think. Roughly 4 billion people, billion with a B, live under an authoritarian government today. And those are people that can't do some things that you might take for granted. For example, they can't write an op-ed in the newspaper. They can't sue their government. They have no real way to hold their government accountable. They can't start a nonprofit like an Amnesty International or like a Greenpeace. They can't really do effective environmental work. They can't do good effective whistleblowing work. They can't even really do good work when it comes to, the areas of labor rights or even religion. So there's a vast percentage, about 52% of humanity, whose rights and freedoms are really restricted in this way. And HRF was founded because it's not just for moral reasons that we want to make sure that everybody has human rights. It's not just because it's the right thing. It also affects everything about humanity. So just to give your listeners some data, something like 96% of all refugees come from authoritarian countries. Something like 18 of the top 20 poorest countries, the ones that are in the most abject poverty, 18 of those 20 countries are dictatorships. 23 of the top 25 countries with the worst access to drinking water are dictatorships. And if you look at things like patent rates, literacy rates, violence, death, homicides, all of these things are not just correlated, but causally linked with bad governance. So we believe that no matter what you care about, whether it's peace or gender equality or religious tolerance or scientific innovation or having a good welfare state, no matter what you care about, in your life and what you care about for humans, democracy and human rights matter.
So since my podcast isn't really a political podcast, and if my listeners are anything like me, their news intake is pretty high in crypto, but somewhat low on everything else, I just want to quickly and briefly define some terms that I imagine you'll probably use fairly frequently throughout this episode. So first, just what are human rights?
So human rights is an umbrella concept that can cover a lot of things. I'm using it primarily to describe civil and political rights, or civil and
those
political
are the ones that you
liberties,
mentioned before?
which are similar to what's in the U.S. Bill of Rights, in the U.S. Constitution, the UN's International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which came into existence 3-4 decades ago. So these are things like, again, the right to protest, the right to participate in your government, the right to speak freely, the right to believe what you want to believe, the right to be free from torture and unjust punishment, the right to privacy, etc. This is traditionally what I mean when I say human rights. I'm talking about basically rights and liberties.
And then earlier when you were talking about like authoritarian governments, so how would you define that? And is the opposite always democracy, or like what type of government, are you in favor of?
The Human Rights Foundation, as a nonprofit, generally looks at governments and breaks them down into 3 types. There are fully authoritarian governments where power is invested entirely in one person or one small group of people. This would be, for example, in North Korea, in China, in Cuba, in Saudi Arabia. Different formats, but the same general idea. Then there are competitive authoritarian countries. So this would be something like Hungary, for instance, which is a country where there's a political party that's eroding power from the opposition and kind of creating like you're seeing a dictatorship start to be born. What competitive authoritarian states do is rig elections. They stack their cronies on the judiciary. They start to kind of manipulate the legislature. They attack independent media. And a third type of government is what we would call a liberal democracy, more or less. So these are, more or less free and open countries. There's no black and white. From Norway to North Korea is an enormous amount of shades of gray, right? But generally speaking, these are the 3 types of governments that we analyze. And we focus our efforts on helping people who live under competitive authoritarian states and fully authoritarian states.
And what are the problems in human rights that you think cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies could help resolve? Well,
it's interesting because I think the human rights background for me and the time spent with people who live and who suffer under and who work under authoritarian governments actually gave me a respect for the revolution that Bitcoin started. When you think about the issue of control and what do governments control and how do they control people, a lot of it starts with money and economics, but you don't really think of it that way. So, for example, at most human rights conferences, currency and payments and economics are not on the agenda at all. But then again, what happens when a dictator wants to shut down a nonprofit? What happens when Mr. Putin, for example, wants to close down an independent media outlet? One of the first things they do is shut down their bank account, right? When a government wants to sort of persecute a particular group of people, for example, they may make that group of people not able to purchase certain things, or they may close them out of a certain part of the economy. When one government wants to hurt another government, they often engage in financial sanctions. There may be financial surveillance attached to certain technology in certain authoritarian states. So when you start thinking about payments and about money and about how money works, you realize that they're intrinsically tied together. And a really, really great newsworthy example of this would be recently in Hong Kong. Protesters knew that if they used their octopus cards, which is kind of like an Oyster card or a Metro card, a little card that they used to access the public transit system in Hong Kong, the students knew that if they used their student octopus cards, which were linked to their identity, to go to the protest, that the government would see that they had gone to the protest. They didn't want that. They didn't want to be spied on. So there were massive lines of people waiting at the machines, which they normally don't do, to buy little cash top-up cards. And I thought that was a really good example of how payments and money are linked to basic civil liberties and civil rights.
Yeah, so let's now shift to your story. How did you first hear about Bitcoin?
I think one of the first times I heard about it was in 2014 when I read Mark Anderson's New York Times article about Bitcoin, which I think still to this day is one of the best articles about Bitcoin. I also had some friends at the time who were organizing a fun little festival in Central California in the Sacramento River Delta called Ephemerisle. And that summer I went there, and I happened to be on a houseboat with Brock Pierce. And Brock was certainly very excited about Bitcoin at the time.
Still is.
Continues to be. And he was an evangelist for it, and he really put it on our radar at the time. It wasn't until a few years later, though, that I realized that there might be an intersection with the work that I did at the Human Rights Foundation. There's an investor named Bill Tai, who I know you know well.
He was, I think, the third guest on my podcast.
Yeah, I mean, Bill's been in the space for a long, long time. And he was at one of our events in 2016, and he said, well, why don't we try and work together? And at the time, and he still is on the board of Bitfury, the mining company. So Bitfury, with Bill's help, was able to come out to the Oslo Freedom Forum in the spring of 2017 and start interacting with human rights activists. And we started having conversations about financial sovereignty and financial privacy and how decentralized money might help people who live under very repressive governments.
And did learning about Bitcoin change your perspective on your human rights work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it gave me a lot more hesitation and pause with regard to the status of freedom in democratic countries. I had always had a lot of respect for, and I still do, of course, for what democratic governments had achieved in terms of protecting certain types of civil liberties. But the more you learn about the way money works and who controls it and how opaque it is and how elite it is and how closed of a system it is in terms of who gets to make the decisions about who prints money, who makes money, who monitors that, who decides when to change things like interest rates, even things like the Bank Secrecy Act in the United States. These aren't things that normal people think about all the time. And even in the human rights space, I hadn't really thought about. Learning about Bitcoin got me a lot more curious about how money is created, who gets to decide when a payment goes through. And of course, I'd seen this a little bit with, and I know a lot of people saw the WikiLeaks example in 2010 as like something that allowed this to come to the fore of the news for a little while, was that major payment processors like Visa were blocking Julian Assange from receiving payments on instructions from the U.S. government, right? And I think that's a good example of ultimately why something like Bitcoin is really important, because at the end of the day, it's a neutral payment platform. Nobody can decide that one person can't receive money or can't send it. And in an age of increasing surveillance, I think that's going to be increasingly important. So as I started to learn more about Bitcoin, I started to look more closely at my own surroundings. And even I'm an American citizen, I was pretty surprised at the level of financial surveillance that exists here, the amount of control over money that the government exerts here, even in what I would call a free country. So it was really, really shocking and surprising. So that's one way that Bitcoin has kind of changed my opinion on the world.
And how did you start incorporating your interest in Bitcoin into your work?
Well, we talk to human rights activists and civil liberties campaigners and civil society leaders from dozens and dozens of countries in very difficult political environments, and we talk to them about what they need. And a lot of them obviously need money. I mean, they need to fundraise. And receiving that money is often difficult. It's often something that can get delayed for long periods of time. It's often something that can get frozen. It's often something they're worried that the bank is going to report to the government. So if you're in a country like Zimbabwe or Russia, it may even be illegal for you to receive payments from abroad, right? From like a do-gooder who wants to help you from abroad, a philanthropist or a foundation, right?
Wow. So,
I'm hearing these complaints and these concerns, which are, of course, decades old for human rights activists. And I'm just sort of thinking to myself, well, we can just send you what if you could just learn how to receive money with Bitcoin? And it's not that complicated. And 2015 is different from today in 2019. Today, in most of the countries that we're actually interested in, there's like massive local liquidity, meaning there's an ability for you to turn Bitcoin, at least, into local currency, whether it's Nigerian naira or Philippine pesos or Chinese renminbi or Venezuelan bolivars or Iranian rial. There is an ability within as little as a few minutes from when Bitcoin hits your wallet and is confirmed onto your wallet until when you can be holding local currency in your hand. I've been interviewing people from different countries, and through some of the countries I just mentioned, we're talking about 10, 15, 20 minutes to change Bitcoin into local currency, which makes it an extraordinarily effective way of moving at least relatively small amounts of money from one place to another.
So you were just talking about Bitcoin, which I know you're a huge proponent of.
Yes.
But then, of course, there are the other technologies in this space. So why don't you lay out for me sort of maybe all the things in crypto that you think could be helpful for fighting human rights and why?
Yeah, I think I'll just break down the three things in Bitcoin that I think are important, and then we can talk about how other currencies may or may not have those things. So we have the deflationary aspect of Bitcoin and the fact that governments can't print more of it. This is very important. It gives Bitcoin value. It gives Bitcoin something that's quite special. The censorship-resistant nature of Bitcoin is really important. The fact that the government can't stop a transaction, even if it doesn't like you, that's extremely important for human rights. And there's many aspects of Bitcoin, but the third one that I'll just kind of point out is the permissionless nature of Bitcoin as a financial tool. Meaning you don't have to ask a government's permission to receive a Bitcoin payment. You don't have to have an ID or a passport. So when we look at like the deflationary nature of Bitcoin, the censorship-resistant nature of Bitcoin, and the permissionless nature of Bitcoin, we have a pretty radical financial tool that I think is quite revolutionary in the way that it changes the ability for people to transact with each other globally. Now, when it comes to other projects and other values, there are some extremely redeeming projects being done by people, especially in the area of privacy. Obviously, Bitcoin is pseudonymous, and there are some serious concerns about whether or not governments are using. We know that like European and American entities are using chain analysis procedures to track and try and observe and surveil people and actually prosecute them based on their Bitcoin activity. It's unclear how many governments are doing that, but it's clearly a large problem. And the Bitcoin technological community, hasn't really, I don't think, risen completely to that challenge. There are some people inside the development community that have made amazing tools that do make it possible for you to at least not be the lowest hanging fruit if you practice good operational security. We've done some research on this that was sponsored by the Zcash Foundation, actually, into the privacy of cryptocurrencies. And Eric Wall, who's a privacy technology fellow at HRF, did two really good pieces on just how private is Bitcoin.
I know. That first one was amazing.
In both a software and the hardware point of view. And the answer is not too dissimilar from like encrypted communications. I mean, it really depends on how good is your operational security, and even if you have perfect operational security, you can still get compromised, right? So that's why projects like Zcash and Monero are very important. Not only are they for, let's say, very technically savvy users, I think, real options when it comes to needing to privately send money to each other. They are aspirational, meaning they inspire everyone else in the industry and community to make more privacy features. So I think that those are two projects that are quite important. And then we have, I think, the technology of the day, or at least of this week, which is Facebook's project, Libra, right? Which I will say, I think, has probably a very large chance of having a really positive impact on humanity. A lot of the things that I find really amazing about Bitcoin are its ability to do these kind of like fast, borderless payments, right? Now, well, we should be clear, in as much as Libra as a piece of technology is not decentralized. It's controlled by a bunch of validators. It's not censorship resistant. And ultimately, it at least won't be at the beginning permissionless. You're going to, according to the marketing materials I've seen, you're going to have to prove your identity to open a Calibri wallet to be able to own and control Libra, at least at the beginning. They're promising a transition to some sort of permissionless environment, which of course sounds exciting. But that's something that's difficult to do once you have a permissioned system. There are a lot of obstacles to that.
They wrote it; they'll do it over 5 years or something.
Yeah, so we'll have to see. I mean, look, I don't. The question is, do people trust Facebook on their promises? And I think that's a really fair question to ask. that's almost a euphemistic statement. I think it's quite fair to distrust Facebook on everything they say, but it's better that they say these things than not. And I think from what I've seen so far, it's only been a matter of hours as we sit here, let's say, since the technical details of what Libra is supposed to be has been announced. But from people I respect who are very technical and who look into things quite deeply and are very skeptical of most projects, have actually said that like this seems like this was very impressively thought out, and it seems like it could be positive for the world. Again, this would be a type of cryptocurrency that's not it doesn't have that permissionless feature that Bitcoin has. It doesn't have that censorship resistant feature that Bitcoin has, and it certainly doesn't have the deflationary aspect that Bitcoin has. It's going to be a stable asset backed by fiat currencies, right? So it will probably track, of course, over time with things like the dollar and yen, which are inflationary. So what's interesting to me is that it has use and value, but it doesn't compete at all with the three things that make Bitcoin really special to me. So I think it's a very complementary technology. Now, I've said a lot of positive things about Libra. I think the main suspicions that I have are around privacy and the collection of information and behavioral and payment data. I don't know exactly how this project's going to work. I do know that they want companies and entities to pay a lot of money to be validators, right? And a lot of those people have already entered into those agreements. And you have to think of like, why would you want to be a validator, right? Like what is in it for you? And my fear is that over time, validators will collect data about how payments work in a way that might be intrusive into our lives and infringe upon our privacies. I certainly don't trust Facebook with my own data. So I would ask you, I mean, do you trust them with your money? I think that there is a possibility, again, that this is like a positive force and something that will help break down barriers, hopefully, between different economies and possibly be quite a good thing for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as it introduces potentially hundreds of millions of people to the idea of money that's not provided by the state, right? So that to me is interesting, but we have to be careful that we aren't building the world's largest financial surveillance machine. I mean, we know what happens when the ability to kind of control money is mixed with a near limitless ability to surveil you. That's what's happening in China today with WeChat. This is an app that basically most urban Chinese people use for virtually everything, and it knows an enormous amount about you, and you use it for all your payments. And payments say more about you than your words, right? So I think we need to be very skeptical about the privacy aspects of Libra. Thankfully, it doesn't exist yet. And we have time as, I think, like human rights activists, as concerned members of the cryptocurrency industry, as investors in Libra, perhaps, are listening to your show, to hold them as honest as possible with regard to how they're going to treat user data and how the system will work, to make sure that it's not, basically a personal data eating machine. I think, from what I've read and what I understand, there are ways in which Libra can be relatively privacy protecting. They have pointed out that they would like to make this a pseudonymous currency, kind of like Bitcoin, which is surprising and certainly positive to hear. But again, we need to be worried about like what the validators are gaining, from running these validation nodes, and we need to be worried about how they can sort of chart payments and how they can potentially censor payments. So the world needs to be like very focused on that. And hopefully we can keep Facebook honest, and we can keep the Libra project something that is a net positive for humanity. So
I mean, I'm sure you saw that they are working with these other nonprofits. So could you see your or the Human Rights Foundation working with them? We
already work with Facebook as a sort of, I guess, the mother entity. And I think our strategy has been, over the years, we also work with Twitter, who's a awesome partner and sponsor.
With Libra.
I guess what I'm getting at is the Human Rights Foundation works with tech companies because our philosophy is we would rather have them involved in this work than not. Like, I want these companies to be listening to the stories of human rights activists and to be understanding the challenges that people face in oppressive governments. So in the same way that, like, the Facebook policy team may come to our events and be involved in our work, yes, we would love for the Libra policy team to also be there, or the Libra engineers to also be there so they can understand some of the obstacles that people are facing around the world. It sounds like from the marketing materials that Libra is very much targeted towards disenfranchised people.
Yeah.
And I think that they need to be in touch with initiatives like the Open Money Initiative and some of the other organizations that we work with at HRF so that they can actually understand, like, what are the financial barriers that people face in these different countries and how can Libra be a force for good in these places. I think, yes, that would be a really good dialogue to have.
All right. So we're going to talk about the Open Money Initiative a little bit later, but I actually wanted to pick up on a couple of things you said. One was you just mentioned something about the relationship between money and state. Mm-hmm. How would you describe a healthy relationship between money and state?
Well, this might sound radical, but I think in 100 years, people will look back in time and think that it was kind of crazy that there was a total monopoly on money by governments, whether it was democracies or dictatorships. I think that a healthier relationship is probably something like where there's a separation of powers. And I'll add some color to that. In the same way that political power, we now think of, or at least I hope most of your listeners think of, tyranny or dictatorship as like a backwards idea, a backwards concept, and that democracy, ruled by the people, is a more fair and just system. And it provides checks on power, checks on arbitrary power, right? Then we have information, right? So I would also hope that your listeners would maybe consider that the open internet, where anyone can permissionlessly access information, is a better system of information than what we had previously, which was sort of like ivory tower and government-controlled information, right? So decentralizing political power and decentralizing information, I think, have been really very progressive, positive forces for humanity. I want to make the same case for money. I think that money needs to be decentralized. I think that people need to be able to be more involved in the creation and distribution of money, and that technology like Bitcoin allows that. In the same way that technology like the printing press or the internet allowed for the distribution and decentralization of information, and that technology like democracy and voting sort of decentralized political power away from tyranny. That's my sort of, I guess, radical idea. But I really believe that an open financial system will be just as healthy for the world as an open political system and as an open information system.
And when you were talking earlier about how the Human Rights Foundation does work with companies like Facebook and Twitter, in general, like, you have a huge technology focus, I feel like, at the foundation. That's just my perception,
yes,
from the Freedom Forum and just some other things. So why is that?
My very first project at the Human Rights Foundation in the summer of 2007 was to put together materials to be sent to the Cuban underground library movement. So it was actually DVDs of foreign films dubbed into Spanish that were things like V for Vendetta and Braveheart. And we did this because information is power, right? At the end of the day, the Cuban government, and this obviously, 12, 13 years later has changed in as much as the Cuban people have a lot more access to the internet via this sort of paquete system where neighborhoods get information from the outside world on satellites and then distribute them amongst their communities. But before that, you basically only were able to understand what the government provided you, which was obviously a very brainwashed, kind of very limited amount of information about how great the Cuban government was and how evil everybody else was. So by giving people books like Animal Farm or 1984 in Spanish, or by giving them access to foreign films that talked about, the struggle for democracy, this was a very popular program, and it was something that made me realize how important literally information technology, at least, was going to be in the struggle for human rights. Later in my career, I worked a lot on our North Korea programs. So we've been sort of smuggling outside information into North Korea for a long time. And that was originally done through literally tying a bag to a balloon and floating it from South Korea over the DMZ into North Korea, and then having a small acid timer go off and the bag would open and DVDs and dollar bills and candy and flash drives would drop into North Korea as a just kind of a omen and a goodwill gesture from the outside world. More recently, we've tapped into the markets that are bustling every day on the border between China and North Korea, and the North Korean refugees that we work with send in information on flash drives through there. So this further reinforced, at least my personal belief, that information was going to be the key in many ways to human rights. Over the years, we also worked on information security, so like helping activists learn how to stay safe with their communications by using tools like Signal, and I guess trying to get a better understanding of how to stay safe online and how to be, not the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to their communications. And I think now, financial freedom and financial privacy and financial sovereignty are just as, if not even more important than all of those things, especially as we head deeper into the information age. I mean, to underline an example I gave you before, today in Hong Kong, people still have the chance to use paper money to top up public transportation cards and to buy SIM cards so that they can plug them into their phone and use Telegram groups without disclosing their identity. They still have that option of using cash. They won't in 5 years or 10 years. There won't be any paper money left. There's only 8% of the world's daily transactions today are paper or metal. 92%, and that's probably a conservative estimate, of all the daily financial transactions in the world are digital. And that's only going to go towards zero as we head through the next decade. So we need private, decentralized money. This is very, very, very important. Otherwise, governments will be able to control their people, and corporations will be able to, control people as well. So private and decentralized money, and I believe that ultimately these two things can come together in the form of Bitcoin and other projects, will be a bulwark against authoritarianism and the surveillance state. I think that's kind of obvious at this point.
We're going to discuss more about North Korea and the corporate surveillance state and the open money initiative and all kinds of things that we mentioned earlier. But first, a quick word from both me as well as our sponsors.
Will the world follow France and advocate banning privacy coins? Will government-backed stablecoins become the new fiat? Are distributed and peer-to-peer exchanges just a flash in the pan? The answer is maybe. Virtual currencies can flourish and create a new, private, and more versatile economy. But that grand vision can't happen without keeping crypto clean. And that requires support of governments and accountability for bad actors. Privacy-enhanced compliance using cryptographic controls has the potential to preserve anonymity without compromising legitimate investigations. CipherTrace is working on this vision of the future. Sign up to stay up to date on the Privacy-Enhanced Compliance Initiative and receive authoritative crypto AML reports quarterly. www.ciphertrace.com/keepcryptoclean. Today's episode is brought to you by Kraken. Kraken is the best exchange in the world for buying and selling digital assets. With all the recent exchange hacks and other troubles, you want to trade on an exchange you can trust. Kraken's focus on security is utterly amazing. Their liquidity is deep, and their fee structure is great, with no minimum or hidden fees. They even reward you for trading so you can make more trades for less. If you're a beginner, you will find an easy on-ramp from 5 fiat currencies. And if you're an advanced trader, you'll love their 5x margin and futures trading. To learn more, please go to Kraken.com. That's KRAKEN.com.
Hey everyone, don't forget, Unchained is doing a survey. And if you give us your feedback, you can be entered to win some pretty awesome prizes. We want to know, how do you think we can make the show better? How would you like to see Unchained expand? Please take a moment and go to surveymonkey.com/r/Unchained Survey 2019. That's surveymonkey.com/r/Unchained Survey 2019. It won't take long, I swear, and when we get all your feedback, Unchained will be even better than before. What more could you want than that? Okay. There is something more you could want. You could maybe want to win some of the prizes we're giving out to survey respondents. You could be one of the 5 lucky people to win a free Casa Bitcoin Lightning node, plus a free year of Casa's Gold membership, including a multi-sig security app for iPhone and Android, a Trezor hardware wallet, a Casa Faraday bag, and 24/7 support. Those of you interested in learning more about Casa or about protecting your Bitcoin investment generally should check out my interview with CEO Jeremy Welch. Thank you to Casa for donating. Again, the URL is surveymonkey.com/r/Unchained Survey 2019. Go there now to give us your thoughts on the future direction of Unchained and enter the giveaway. Back to my conversation with Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation. Of the economies that have so far been using Bitcoin for human rights purpose, where do you think it's been having a noticeable impact, or which countries' usage kind of closely matches how you think Bitcoin could be used in its most useful or non-speculative form?
Right. So I think at its current stage of its technology, from what I've seen, the most useful way to adopt Bitcoin and where we've actually seen people using it is as a cross-border payment, basically, a cross-border payment mechanism as a bridge between two monies. So I'll give more detail to that. But essentially, in a place like Venezuela or Iran or the Philippines or Nigeria or India or China, these are some of the countries that I've done interviews in, Turkey, there are restrictions on what local citizens can do with regard to the world markets. They are cut off in some way. Again, that way might be because of their own government's financial controls. It might be because of U.S. sanctions. It might be because of capital controls. It might be because of lack of infrastructure. It might be because of high fees in the banking sector. There are quite a number of reasons, but at the end of the day, you have billions of people who are disconnected from the financial world. And what we're observing through research is that some of these people are using Bitcoin as a way to access other money, meaning US dollars, euros, etc. So you have like someone that I was just with at the Oslo Freedom Forum who's of Iranian descent, and her partner, she was saying, her partner's family, someone is very sick in Iran, and her partner's family, they live in London. Bitcoin has been a way for them to send money to pay for cancer treatments in Iran. Otherwise, it'd be very difficult for them to send money from London to Tehran. This is not something that's easy to do, right?
Yeah. Actually, just for listeners, I think Peter McCormack released that panel on what Bitcoin did, which she spoke about that there. So
yeah, this is an internet researcher named Masa who's pursuing a doctorate at Oxford at the moment, and she basically revealed in this conversation that was on Peter's show about how her family uses Bitcoin to send payments to Iran so that this person can pay for cancer treatment. That was, I thought, pretty powerful. A couple other stories would be that, in countries like Philippines and Nigeria, and these are massive countries, 100 million person countries, right? Tens of millions of people in each of these countries are non-resident workers. So I believe it's about 10 million in the Philippines and more in Nigeria. And these are people that live in countries outside of Nigeria and the Philippines, and where they don't have a bank account. So they're at the mercy of like third parties to get their money back to their family. And in the case of the Philippines, a lot of these folks work in South Korea. Okay, so they need to send Korean won somehow back to the Philippines, where it needs to be received by their family in pesos, right? So that traditionally has been a convoluted, delayed, slow process, where on average, according to Luis Buenaventura, who's an entrepreneur in this space, who was also on Peter's panel, this can be, roughly about 7.5% is the fee you may pay end to end to get a $100 or a $200 remittance back from a place like Korea to the Philippines. So his company, Bloom, started working in South Korea in, I think, 2014, 2015, and they were able to get that fee down to 3% using a Bitcoin-based solution. So that, to me, is indicative of the power that I think Bitcoin can have with regard to these cross-border payments that transcend governmental financial boundaries. Another good example would be, to be more specific about Nigeria, Timmy, our friend Timmy, who runs Bitcoins, which is a Lagos-based sort of cryptocurrency wallet and exchange.
Timmy's great.
Love Timmy. But basically, Timmy was explaining how, some, very, very clever Nigerians are using Bitcoin basically to make money in an arbitrage way on the way that different currencies float against each other, so that they're not speculating in the traditional sense, meaning like buying some Bitcoin and trying to sell it when it's hot and trying to buy it when it's low. They're actually using Bitcoin to acquire foreign currency and try to make money in that way. So it was really interesting for him to talk about that. And again, I think in places like this, whether you're behind U.S. sanctions in Iran, or whether you're behind governmental sanctions in a place like Venezuela, or whether you're just not really tied into the world financial ecosystem, Bitcoin does provide you this lifeline or this other opportunity to get access to the world economy. So that's what I think we can observe and testify as currently the use case. Now, as Bitcoin hopefully becomes more usable, and as there's wider adoption of people who accept it, hopefully, as payment, let's say, then we can maybe start talking about it in the fight against financial surveillance. We're not really there yet, because no one really will. It's not like the subway in New York City or in Hong Kong will accept Bitcoin for payments. So we can't really talk about it as a way of protecting our daily financial habits until it adopts that in that certain way. But it certainly technically could be the answer for that. I think the answer there is more of a socially and politically, will it be feasible? But at the moment, the way that I've seen Bitcoin change the world and be a liberation tool for people is as this sort of way to neutrally and permissionlessly send money from one person to anyone else on the planet. And all you need is a smartphone and internet access. You don't need a bank account. You don't need a passport. And that's very, very powerful.
But so right now, obviously, this is happening on a very small scale. I think I actually heard you when I was researching this, that you said that less than 1% of the world's population has been exposed to Bitcoin, something like that. So what can you or HRF try to do to make these technologies, either more useful or more widespread, or is that not your role? How do you want to get to this vision that you're...
Yeah. Well, I think it's very similar to thinking about encrypted communications technology, something like a signal, right? In the case of, let's take Bitcoin, for example, or even add all the other cryptocurrencies, right? I think best estimates are 40 to 60 million people by this point have interacted meaningfully with cryptocurrencies. Okay. So again, that's less than 1% of the world's population. So you're right in that aspect in terms of it's small when you compare it to the whole world, but it's quite a number of people who've been affected by it. I mean, we're talking millions of people who've had their lives changed in a meaningful way because of cryptocurrency, right? And in that aspect, I think it's probably similar to the path that encrypted messaging has taken, where at first encrypted messaging, generally speaking, was greeted by the wider public with skepticism, and certainly by hostility by the powers that be, in terms of, well, what do you have to hide if you're using encrypted messaging, right? If you're a digital privacy advocate, what are you hiding, right? So these were arguments that we went through in the 90s in terms of, what possibly could you want if you're trying to encrypt something and send it to somebody? It could only be bad, right? I think there's been a sea change in public attitude since then, especially after the Snowden revelations, about the idea that, no, we actually need digital privacy in our communications.
Wait, but do you really think that there's been a sea change?
Absolutely.
Because I feel like after the Snowden thing, a lot of surveys showed that people actually didn't change their behaviors, and they kind of said that they cared about privacy, but then they didn't really do anything about it. I mean, you even with the delete Facebook thing, which happened last year, a tiny fraction of people actually did delete.
Well, let's
Facebook.
actually break that down. So what I'm saying is that there is more public support now. Whether or not I say I support privacy and I go home and download Signal, that's a different conversation.
Okay.
I'm just saying there's been wider public support for the idea that people should have private communications.
Right, but I'm saying how do we get to those behaviors, which
right.
we are not there yet, let alone with Bitcoin.
So in the same way that there's now wider public support after massive revelatory incidents like the Snowden and whether it's WikiLeaks, Snowden, et cetera, into the fact that like the ability to whistleblow securely is important. The ability to communicate securely is important. These things lead to a change in public behavior. Now, the change in public behavior may not result in your friends using encrypted messaging, but it creates a different climate for companies. So after the Snowden case, one of the most successful things I can point to is that WhatsApp decided to add end-to-end encryption to its messenger. That's right. Massive, right? They didn't have to do that. They did that as a result of a change of public opinion, right? So oftentimes public opinion can drive companies who have vast numbers of users to do things differently and in the name of privacy and security for people. So that's been something we've seen happen, and I think we can hang our hat on that and hope to keep pushing in that direction. So in the same way, you're seeing Facebook today basically do something quite brazen, announce that not only are they creating a new currency that's not going to be just the US dollar, but that it potentially will be permissionless. Now, again, I had a lot of concerns with the Libra project, but that's something that's unbelievable, and no one would have ever guessed that could have happened 5 years ago. In the era of 2014 Bitcoin, if you had told somebody that in 5 years, Bitcoin, Facebook was going to be announcing its own permissionless cryptocurrency, I think you would have probably been laughed out of the room.
Right.
But it just happened today. So big tech companies have the potential to lay a lot of the groundwork for this. And in the same way that, I think a lot of people probably learned first about, what is encryption, because WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger turned it on, right? And they got a little notification about it. Tens of millions of people got a notification about it on that day. I think now, through Facebook, a lot of people are going to learn what cryptocurrency is. And they're going to learn that money doesn't need to be provided by a government.
Yeah, and since it starts off permissioned, I wonder...
It won't be the solution. But I think it's a step in the right direction. I think we have to be philosophically flexible about it. Even in the Bitcoin space, think about how excited Bitcoiners are about the fact that, certainly quite a few Venezuelans have used Bitcoin, right, as a means of survival and commerce, etc. However, most Venezuelans, according to the Open Money Initiative, when they use something like local Bitcoins to exchange, their money into and out of bolivars, they don't own their own private keys. They're using local Bitcoins as a digital escrow. Right? So this is not philosophically what we want as Bitcoiners, right? Quote unquote. I think Bitcoiners, want people to use their private key and have sovereignty over their money. That's not happening in Venezuela by and large. But it doesn't mean that it's not a good step in the right direction. So I think we need to retain a certain level of philosophical flexibility while still being skeptical. So I guess what I'm saying is, even if you don't trust WhatsApp, which was later then acquired by Facebook, or you don't trust Facebook with Messenger, or you don't trust Telegram, or you don't trust now Facebook with Libra, it's really good to see these companies going in that direction. Look at Apple. I mean, Apple's trying to remake itself as a privacy company. And I think we should be excited about that. We should be skeptical, and we should hold their feet to the fire. But as someone who cares about user privacy, I'm really grateful that these companies are trying to please an audience that cares about privacy and that cares about permissionless finance, let's say, as opposed to the other model in the world, the Chinese model, where the dominant apps are so real-time censored that it seems like it's an episode out of Black Mirror, So these are positive developments, I think.
Yeah. I don't know. It's one of those things where I feel like there is still that gap between what people say or and what they do, because even in Europe now, when you go and you get all these pop-ups on every website, being like, we're collecting information about you for our cookies.
Right.
Everybody just accepts, or you know what I mean? It's there's no, I don't know. I just feel like, what are you going to do? Be like, okay, I'm not going to read this website now. I'm not, So in that regard, I just feel.
Well, I agree with you on that. I do think people trade their freedoms and privacy for convenience far too often. In fact, at the Oslo Freedom Forum this year, we had an exhibit, and it showed people who maybe haven't used WeChat before how it works, and it was a sort of a translation into English of the Chinese model of WeChat, let's say. And it was up above the interface was this mirrored image of the word evil and the word easy. Right? Because it's so easy, but it's also evil, So giving up all your privacy and freedom is convenient. It is something that people will want. So I think, the answer for people who care about civil liberties and personal freedoms and personal data lies in the technology producers and the technologists making something that is convenient. That's key. So WhatsApp Messenger is convenient. So them adopting what's like end-to-end encryption is a good step in the right direction. I guarantee you that whatever this wallet that Libra is going to be used with, Calibra, this thing's going to be awesome in terms of its user design. I can guarantee it. It's going to be super easy to use, and it's going to on-ramp a whole bunch of people onto non-government provided money. And I think that that's really interesting.
Yeah, but that is the part that's offered by Facebook itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm skeptical of the impact that projects like this will have on privacy, and I'm worried. But at the same time, I think we have to understand that things like this are going to on-ramp more people onto the general concepts, and I think this is going to be great for Bitcoin, probably. I mean, I think it'll get more people interested. I mean, look, a lot of people are going to learn about cryptocurrency first about Libra. They're going to first learn it through Libra, and then they're going to dig around on message boards and email and newsletters, and they're going to be like, what is this Bitcoin thing? And then they're going to learn about Bitcoin. And that's going to be like, the red pill moment in the Matrix, where they've heard about Libra, and then all of a sudden, wow, this is the real deal. This thing is actually permissionless. This thing's actually decentralized. This thing's actually censorship
you're a
resistant.
believer, so, but I'm not sure.
Well, I don't.
People might just use Libra and might be like, oh, this is cool. This works.
Here's the thing: the world is a lot bigger than New York or San Francisco, where you and I, spend most of our time. Probably, yes, Americans are pretty blasé about privacy, but the people I work with, they care about it. Oh, wow. So if I can tell people, in Zimbabwe or in Hong Kong or in places that are actually facing an actual either authoritarian government or authoritarian challenge, they will rise to the occasion. I mean, it's amazing to watch what Hong Kongers are doing today. They're pulling out all the stops. They're wearing masks to confuse facial recognition, and they're using cash to, quietly, use public, transportation services, and quietly use social media coordination services. It's pretty amazing. So I do have this belief that people will rise to the occasion. They just won't do it where they're not pushed to do it. And in America and in Europe, we live in societies where we take our freedoms for granted. For sure, most people do.
Yeah.
So I think the innovations will come elsewhere. That's why you're seeing Bitcoin being adopted in Lagos and in Caracas and in Tehran, where Massa at the Oslo Freedom Forum was saying that if you get into a cab in Tehran today, people are going to be asking you about Bitcoin. Like, adoption's happening in these places, not in Los Angeles or Sydney or Tokyo. And I think that that's all cohesive. I think that all makes sense. These technologies will be adopted where they're most needed.
Yeah. No, watching the Hong Kong thing has actually been somewhat emotional for me, because I'm just like, oh my gosh, if I were to have grown up in a country that's similar to the US and then suddenly have it become more in China, I would also be like them. I would be like, oh my God, no, this is terrible. But anyway, so I we're running out of time, and I have 5 million questions for you. And we keep talking about the Open Money Initiative, and we keep referencing Venezuela. So just talk a little bit about kind of this initiative that you're backing, and what it is that you guys are seeing there, and what you hope you can accomplish with the Open Money Initiative, and what it is.
The Human Rights Foundation has always had a founding focus on Venezuela, and in 2006 and 7 and 8, it was tough because a lot of people thought Hugo Chavez was a great guy, and they were like, well, he's a man of the people. Now, today, it's uncool to support populists. It's uncool to support authoritarians. But at the time, people loved Chavez. They thought he was the best thing since sliced bread, generally speaking. I mean, I just remember when I first started at HRAF, it was very difficult to have serious conversations about, and I would say things like, well, he's stacking the Supreme Court, and he's taking radio stations off the air, and he's taking the licenses away from TV stations, and he's putting journalists in prison. People just didn't want to hear it. They really wanted to support him. And unfortunately, sadly, we were right to sound the alarm on Venezuela, and it has become the worst disaster in the Western Hemisphere. 4 million Venezuelans have already left Venezuela, and as many as 8 million will have left by the end of next year. And the average Venezuelan has lost something like 25 pounds. There is just starvation. There's absolute destruction in the form of hyperinflation, massive theft and corruption, environmental destruction, you name it. So this has all happened in the last decade, and it has happened increasingly since 2014 and 15. And we've always been an organization that's focused on helping civil liberties and political rights in Venezuela. We've always looked at assessing the health of the country in that area, and we've watched it deteriorate. Now, what was much more acute almost was the economic deterioration of Venezuela over the last 5 years. So when I met a group of very enterprising researchers and designers last summer who wanted to investigate, how were Venezuelan IDPs or refugees living in Colombia, interacting with the world financially. I thought this was a fascinating project. So the Human Rights Foundation is very proud to support the Open Money Initiative and their efforts to understand, how can the outside world be helpful in designing technology that Venezuelans can use that can benefit their lives. And I like that they're coming at this from an agnostic point of view, from a platform perspective or a protocol perspective. They're not going there to push a particular project. They're going there with open hearts and open ears and open minds, and they're basically providing the world with a perspective on what do Venezuelans need. And what do Venezuelans need? Dollars, US dollars. I mean, Bitcoin is such a very distant second, you know what I mean? And there are even different types of US dollars. There's dollars in Zelle and dollars in RTM, and then there's cash dollars, and they all have their different prices, right? So we're learning about this kind of amazing, kind of tragic, but also kind of fascinating microeconomy that has grown in this area.
And why would the value be different depending on what form it's in?
So more people will accept different types of U.S. dollars as merchants inside Venezuela. So it's easier for you to spend, for example, one type of app's dollars than another type of app's dollars.
I see.
Okay, so they have a premium on the price. Some are more valuable, right? In the same way that digital bolivars are a different value than printed bolivars, because you only need printed bolivars for certain things, and they're harder to access, right? So it's fascinating to see this kind of new, again, tragic, but kind of fascinating to see this new economy being born. And there's, a lot of suffering, and there's nothing you can take away from it, but sadness, as the world does relatively nothing, to help Venezuelan refugees. Big institutions and groups like the World Bank and, I think organizations that typically help refugees, I don't know. I just feel like they don't see Venezuelans in the same light as they see maybe Somalis or Syrians or Afghanis yet. I mean, even though it's the exact same human situation, there's something about it where they're not quite seen as refugees in the same way yet. I think that shift will come. But in the meantime, I think getting companies to understand how they can play a role is useful. And the Open Money Initiative is providing a window into how money works in Venezuela and what people can do. And, hearing them talk, I mean, I know that, for example, designing, open source apps that run on older phones that would allow people to, for example, receive different kinds of digital assets, whether it's Zelle credits or RTM credits or Bitcoin, and then exchange them into bolivars. Building an app that would do all of that in one would be fantastic. So coming to an understanding of these things and then going back to the industry and saying, here's what people need, I think is a really, really valuable design research thing that the Open Money Initiative is doing and that HRF would love to support in other countries around the world too.
So I want to switch the topic now to North Korea, which is personally very interesting to me because I'm of North Korean Korean heritage, but partially North Korean. So far what we've been discussing is all the ways that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are good for evading surveillance states or oppressive regimes. But that is actually also the aspect that makes it good for a country like North Korea to evade sanctions. And in general, I just feel like that country, when we're talking about how Bitcoin can be used against authoritarian regimes, is the one outlier, simply because North Koreans don't have access to the internet, so they can't really use Bitcoin against the regime. So is that just going to have to be the way that it's going to be? Because actually so far what's going on there is that North Korea itself, the government, is benefiting from Bitcoin. Yeah. So how do you think Bitcoin can help that situation?
Well, I think when it comes to North Korea, I think we have to look at how the government sustains itself. And at the end of the day, it's about power and control and fear. Now, it is true that the North Korean government has figured out, is very clever, is very smart. They've figured out that having a sophisticated cyber warfare capacity is very important, right? So putting money even aside for a second, they've been very successful in hacking public infrastructure in South Korea. Of course, we all know about the Sony hacks that ricocheted across America many Christmases ago. There's all kinds of sabotage attacks that they've done internationally that they've been quite effective in. Exactly. Now, when it comes to money, yes, it definitely seems like from what we've observed that the North Korean government has figured out if they rob cryptocurrency exchanges, that can be an effective way for them to steal money that they need. But generally speaking, I think from a bird's eye view, virtually all of the money that the North Korean government runs on is in the form of dollars and renminbi and their own money. Bitcoin makes up a very small percentage of the ability of the North Korean government to hold on to control. I think long term, Bitcoin as a decentralized form of money that will inevitably seep into North Korea in a way that the government cannot stop at the end of the day will only be a bad thing for the North Korean government.
Wait, you mean to the people?
Absolutely.
How so?
Satellite access already. So today, there is satellite coverage over North Korea. If you look at Blockstream, if you look at the map on their website. So if I had a a small satellite device, I can send and receive Bitcoin transactions in the middle of North Korea without any internet. That's a start.
Is that something that the Human Rights Foundation would try to do?
That is something.
I mean, how would they get liquid?
I think anyone who's doing that probably wouldn't say that on a podcast. What I will say is that there is liquidity, massive liquidity in China and at the Chinese border of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is immediately valuable in Chinese border cities. So I'm just painting a hypothetical here, but North Koreans are the most creative and entrepreneurial people in the world. They're the most bold and creative. They will do anything they can to survive.
Wait, really?
North
I feel
Koreans,
like they've been totally brainwashed.
Despite all odds.
How can they be creative?
So the North
they were
Korean
not trained to be
defectors,
creative.
I know, exactly. But they are incredible. The ones that I've met, the people who've escaped, used so much, not just bravery, but ingenuity, cleverness. I mean, these are people who don't have the tools we have. They don't have the freedoms we have, and they have to figure it out anyway. And I'm just saying that they figure it out. They've been so successful in just exploiting the tiniest little slivers of freedom to maximize the well-being for their family and their friends. And I wouldn't bet against them. Let's put it that way.
No, I agree with you with the defectors for sure. I would never bet against.
I'm not talking about the government. I'm talking the people of North Korea are going to really turn lemonade out of lemons. The point I'm saying is that over time, as more and more equipment gets into North Korea that can send and receive information over the internet, and as there already exists a way to send and receive Bitcoin in North Korea, and as things like open dimes, which is a way of physically trading Bitcoin like in physical cash, potentially popularize, and as cryptocurrency and Bitcoin continues to increase in popularity in China, it's only a matter of time before this stuff seeps into North Korea and starts eating away at the government's control over money. One of the more interesting things that I heard from a North Korean defector was from Tae Young-ho, who you met at the Oslo Freedom Forum.
He was amazing.
Tae Young-ho is the highest-ranking diplomat to ever escape from North Korea. And I asked him a question because I had heard that in 2009, the North Korean government scrapped its currency and introduced a new currency completely, meaning people who had saved for decades in cash, that pile of money under their bed was all of a sudden useless. And I was so curious about this. And Tae Young-ho, of course, was there and a very high-ranking official, so he knew all about this. It's never been reported in the English media, but I wanted to learn from him about what exactly happened. And he was basically saying that the economic minister of unity, or whatever they called him, after this happened, the plan didn't work as predicted. Basically, people were so despondent over this that they just didn't go to the markets for a day or two. That's about as much protest as they could muster. They just didn't go to sell their wares because they were so depressed about what had happened to their savings. And because of this, it was a period of depressed economic activity, according to Mr. Tae. And several days later, Kim Jong-il had the Minister of Economic Unity executed with an AK-47, is what he told me, which I thought was pretty shocking. But this is
par for the course there.
Yeah, but this is a story about how the government is trying to hold on control of the population through manipulating money. And at the end of the day, Bitcoin will prevent them from doing that. So it might be a very far-off thing, but I can't imagine that Bitcoin like in a sort of an umbrella, net kind of impact way is positive for the North Korean government. I mean, maybe short term, fine, but long term, it's a technology that eats away and destroys authoritarianism. Because at the end of the day, all authoritarians hold on to control over their people through financial control.
I love it. Okay, hopefully you're right that this will happen over the long term. So I want to ask just sort of generally about regulation, because so I had multiple questions on this, but I'm going to try to wrap it into one. So we've seen local Bitcoins disabling cash ads, halting operations in Iran, and presumably these are functions that I think you would advocate for and think could help people fight authoritarian regimes. So in general, how do you think regulation in the crypto space should be handled?
Well, not like that. I think there's a lot of fear. And European regulators seem to be the worst offenders at the moment. It's really sad to see free countries crack down the hardest on this new technology, even harder than dictatorships. It's bizarre. But, the Finnish government has got to realize that when it basically forces a company like Local Bitcoins to, whether it's complying by orders from the American government or not, when it or EU orders or whatever, when it forces a company to cut off services in a country like Iran, that it's cutting off a lifeline that's helping people. I wish they would look at it like, how can we help Iranians, as opposed to how can we comply with these draconian economic policies? I think that this is just the beginning. I think that centralized exchanges, I don't know if you've seen this, but over the last few days, several other platforms have closed off access to U.S. users. And I think you're going to start seeing this more and more. And it's a phase we're going to go through where at first governments just for a long time, of course, didn't understand or didn't know about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. And then they sort of laughed it off. And now they're starting to take it seriously, and now they're going to start to crack down a little bit. I think the worst is obviously yet to come when it starts actually eating away at their power. But we may not be there for a little while. But I think you're going to start to see more and more attacks. I mean, India has already, really restricted the ability of exchanges to operate in that country, obviously. Not a great thing to see in the world's largest democracy, really anti-innovation and kind of tragic. But you're going to see this happen in Europe, and maybe through the good work of people like Coin Center, maybe the U.S. government will not do the worst things that it could do, and maybe it'll be a little more open-minded. And I do have some hope that the U.S. government will be a little more open-minded than these European and Indian regulators, based on just conversations I've had and things I've heard from U.S. regulators, but we'll see. I think it's unquestionably a bad thing to cut off technology access to people living under dictatorships, and I hope that companies see that. And I've certainly talked to other, I guess, more able, just because of that they're smaller and more nimble. But companies like, for example, Paxful, or companies like, for example, there's like BISC, for example.
And what do those do?
These are sort of more, we'll say, peer-to-peer marketplaces, more sort of decentralized exchanges, where people rely less on an intermediary in a setup like BISC. But basically, these people are like super excited about being able to provide access to like users in places like Iran. So when one exchange gets shut down, the others, I think, are reacting in an interesting way. So I certainly hope that companies can do what they can to fight off the regulation and keep services alive in these countries that need it.
So you just mentioned a couple of companies, but in general, like, which crypto companies or projects are working in areas that you think are the most promising for human rights purposes? Well,
I mean, look, it's true to say that even though Local Bitcoins has stopped its services in Iran, that it is overwhelmingly the most important company in the world when it comes to providing liquidity and ability to turn Bitcoin and other digital assets into local money. It is just absolutely so important in a country like Venezuela, critical. So important in other countries. I mean, it's fairly dominant in places like Nigeria. If you interview people there, fairly dominant in Southeast Asia, very important in East Asia. So I think Local Bitcoins is kind of a real lifeline right now. So I hope we can figure out ways to support them and help them, fend off more regulation because people really at the moment need their service. I mean, it's just sort of network effect in that they were there first, and that people trust local Bitcoins as a brand in these places. But it's really kind of amazing to watch the volume like in these places. Just to give one example, today the volume of exchange in local Bitcoins from Bitcoin to Bolivar is multiple times that of the Caracas stock exchange.
Yeah, I saw you wrote that.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess it's a low bar because who's investing in Venezuelan stock market, but it's a paradigm shift, right? And probably one of many. Like in the future, crypto exchanges will be much larger than stock markets. Like I think this is the first example. This isn't just like some hypothetical I came up with. I'm reporting an actual fact. So yes, it's in an extreme economic example, a dystopian one, I would say, but I think things are going to get worse before they get better in a lot of places. And again, cryptocurrency is going to be a serious alternative option for folks.
All right. So I think the last questions I have for you are just about like where people can learn more about you and HRF, but also I noticed, so HRF accepts Bitcoin for donations.
Yes.
How popular is it for people to do that?
Over time.
And then do you like immediately convert it or do you keep the Bitcoin?
Yeah. So these are interesting questions. So we started receiving Bitcoin donations in 2014. And they've been very helpful over the years. And I certainly would encourage people to send them to us. We generally have a policy of converting the Bitcoin into dollars to spend them on operating programs. Okay. But if you write us with a note with your intention that you'd like us to keep it, this is something I'm looking into with the help of certain people, of basically setting up a sort of an ability for you to make a donation in Bitcoin to us, for example, that we would agree to hold on to for a certain amount of time. So I really like this idea, and certainly if listeners want to help me design this, give legal advice, etc., I would very much welcome that. You can reach me at alex@hrf.org or on Twitter at Gladstein, my handle. So we would very much be open to like long-term Bitcoin donations and donations of other cryptocurrencies if that's something you're interested in. And I would just lay out like as a final thought, like the four things that we would like that the Human Rights Foundation would really like to do in the cryptocurrency space. So number one would be design research, much like what the Open Money Initiative is doing. We'd love to replicate and share some of those findings and procedures around the world so that people can understand what's happening in these countries and that we can design better tools for people who need them. That's number one. Number two would be public education. So we're doing a lot of like public education about Bitcoin cryptocurrencies, in medium formats and in events and conferences that are not cryptocurrency related. So, for example, when I write something in Time or CNN or I speak at an economist conference, I think that's in many ways very effective compared to like just sort of speaking to the same small group of people,
right.
Which I mean, I know and love, but like we really got to get out to the 99% that don't know anything about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. So public education is totally key. A third area would be providing opportunities for, let's say in the case of Bitcoin, core development. So currently core development is something that's done by not enough people. And a lot of that is because there are just certain niche resources you need to understand to learn how to code and to meaningfully contribute to Bitcoin Core, for example. So we'd love to try and support people from around the world to come to some of the classes of people like Jimmy Song or Justin Moon or Chain Code, etc., and be able to have that experience. So that's something I'd love to work on is sort of diversifying, whether it be from geographical diversity, gender diversity, etc. And the fourth area, which I think is kind of most interesting, is operational security for activists. I mean, if they're authentically, and I can tell you they are authentically interested in receiving Bitcoin payments and sending them, as opposed to carrying bags of cash on a bus or, being reliant and fearful about their bank account, they do want to use Bitcoin, but they need to know how to use it, and they need to know how to use it safely or as safe as possible. And that's not like easy to find information. You really have to kind of piece that together. And most of these folks are brave, entrepreneurial activists, not technologists, right? So they need like easy to understand guides and mentorship. with regard to Bitcoin operational security. So, we'd like to partner with you and anyone else on these areas of design research into global cryptocurrency adoption, public education about Bitcoin, diversifying the people who are doing the core development, and doing operational security for people who actually want to use the stuff.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on Unchained.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
To learn more about Alex and the Human Rights Foundation, check out the show notes inside your podcast player. If you haven't yet taken the Unchained survey, now is the time. Go to surveymonkey.com/r/Unchained survey 2019 to tell us how we can do better at Unchained. And don't forget, those who answer the survey can enter to win one of 5 free Casa Bitcoin Lightning nodes, plus a free year of Casa's Gold membership. Thanks, Casa, for donating. Unchained is produced by me, Laura Shin, with help from Fractal Recording, Anthony Yoon, Daniel Nuss, and Rich Straffolino. Thanks for listening.